Welcome back, everybody, to U.S.-Russian relations, a history. Everything changes when Harry S. Truman becomes president on the death of Franklin Roosevelt on April 12th, 1945. This is about a month before the Second World War will come to an end. In fact, Hitler will commit suicide in the last days of April, if not even less than a month. Harry S. Truman is going to be famous, of course, for that sign he used to have on his desk, "The buck stops here." The implication being, of course, that he takes responsibility for whatever decisions are made and what happens in the United States. Truman was born on May 8th, 1884, in Lamar, Missouri, the son of a farmer and livestock dealer. His grandparents owned slaves, and Truman, we'll see, has a typical Missouri South ingrained racist upbringing, even if later, as the president, he advanced integration in the U.S. military. Privately, he will remain a white supremacist throughout his life. After graduating from high school in 1901, Truman will work as a timekeeper on the Santa Fe Railroad, slept in hobo camps near the railway lines, worked with railway crews. He then worked a number of clerical jobs, and in 1906 he returned back to his family farm, and he stayed there until 1917, when he went into military service at the age of 33, although he served in the National Guard prior to 1917. Truman would serve as a field artillery battery commander, a captain in France during World War I. He shocks his troops by using profanities that he had learned while working on the Santa Fe Railroad. And such language was not expected of an officer in those days, nor of a president. Truman will become known for his kind of swearing and outspokenness. It's going to be celebrated in a Broadway play in the 1980s, one of the first kind of big successful one-man shows on Broadway, "Give 'Em Hell, Harry," with James Whitmore. And it's a kind of theme in American culture as well, in political culture. There's, "Give 'Em Hell, Harry" website. There often you see these various posts with Truman speaking out whatever crosses his mind. Truman, after the First World War, will marry a fairly traditional woman, Bess, who, unlike Roosevelt's very political and active wife and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, would be very different when she becomes the First Lady. Here's a quote from Bess Truman. A woman's place in public is to sit beside her husband, be silent, and be sure her hat is on straight. Truman, who can't keep his hat on straight, is going to open a hat store in Kansas. But the business fails, and he declares bankruptcy in 1921. And this is in an era when everybody wore a hat. So I'm not quite sure what the backstory is there, why this 1921 bankruptcy. Truman will choose to enter politics almost cynically as a way of securing a paying job for himself, essentially. He'll say, my choice early in life was either to be a piano player in a whorehouse or a politician. And to tell the truth, there's hardly any difference. Give him hell, Harry. So Truman, with the endorsement of the Democratic Party, was elected as a presiding judge in Jackson County, Missouri, although he didn't actually preside over any trials. Presiding judges, it's kind of a title for what in other states are called state commissioners. It's a kind of a management clerical job, but he begins this kind of long career in politics with this job. And he certainly learns everything there is to learn about politics in that first job as commissioner. In 1934, he's going to run as a U.S. Senator from Missouri on a Democratic Party ticket. He's elected. Throughout the 1930s, Truman will be a supporter of Roosevelt and his New Deal, and he campaigned for Roosevelt, but Truman shows very little interest in international affairs. And when he did speak on international affairs, he tended to be crude and simplistic. On June 23rd, 1941, the day after Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union, Senator Truman declares, quote, if we see that Germany is winning, we ought to help Russia. And if Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany. And that way, let them kill as many as possible. Although I don't want to see Hitler victorious under any circumstances. Neither of them thinks anything of their pledged word. End of quote. Truman is considered to be a center faction Democrat, and Roosevelt will choose Truman as his vice presidential candidate in the 1944 election over his current vice president, Henry Wallace, who it was thought was too left wing and too pro labor. And the other thing, of course, is Truman's views on race as well were acceptable to kind of the conservative Southern factions in the Democratic Party, even if Truman was considered a centrist. So this was Roosevelt's way of kind of co-opting the more conservative Southern factions in the Democratic Party who would have objected to another term with Henry Wallace. And of course, Roosevelt is running now in November of 44, will run for an unprecedented fourth term after Roosevelt's presidency, there will be an amendment to the Constitution prohibiting a president from running more than twice, or holding office more than twice. And prior to that, it was tradition, but it wasn't written in the Constitution, and so Roosevelt broke that tradition. He was enormously popular, so he is the only president elected to the to 4 terms, but he never got to really serve out, as we saw very much of his term, his 4th term. But Truman's views on race are going to help him now in this election that is already, it's evident that the war is going to be coming to an end, and whoever is going to be elected president is going to be leading the United States through a post-war period. I won't dignify Truman's views by reading them. You can read this sad quotation for yourselves. And of course, once Truman is in the White House, he's going to tone down, these kinds of statements, although he's going to continue to express them privately. Roosevelt never particularly trusted or liked Truman. And so he never introduced Truman into the loop. Truman had no idea what Roosevelt's plans were, what his foreign policy goals were. Truman, even though he was vice president, did not know about the existence of the Manhattan Project, which was successfully completing the final stages of the construction of the first atomic bomb. It's going to be tested in July in the desert of New Mexico. And so Truman essentially blunders into the presidency with the kind of same simplistic naivete that he had conducted himself as a commissioner in Jackson County, Missouri, and as a senator. In fact, he writes to his wife, Bess, quote, once he becomes president, he writes, quote, "It won't be long until I can sit back and study the whole picture, and there'll be no more to this job than there was to running Jackson County, and not any more worry." End of quote. So Truman is only vice president for 82 days when FDR dies. By the time Truman settled into the Oval Office, the friction over Poland that I had described to you in the last lecture had gone up another notch. The Russians announced they intended to now conclude a treaty of mutual assistance with the government of Poland, a government that the British and the USA were refusing to recognize. And so this was further indication from the British and American point of views that the Soviets were not going to honor the terms of the Yalta Agreement. That's how they interpreted this. April, of course, is when the San Francisco conference is scheduled, and all the countries that will be joining the United Nations, as the United Nations Charter is going to be signed at this San Francisco conference, are beginning to arrive in Washington to work out all the final details before they proceed to San Francisco. And so the Soviet foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, arrives in Washington on April 22nd. And of course, Molotov is the man of the hammer. Molotok means hammer. Molotov is the hammerer, I guess, is the literal translation of that term. It's his revolutionary name. His real name was Scriabin. He was actually related to the composer Scriabin. This is obviously, first of all, a Stalin survivor, and as well a very tough, experienced diplomat who not only shook Roosevelt's and Churchill's hand, but Hitler's and Mussolini's as well. He has dealt with some very powerful individuals in that period of history. So Molotov will arrive in Washington on April 22nd, and Truman is very anxious to meet Molotov and see him. And so a meeting is scheduled between Truman and Molotov that very same day in the evening. Truman promises his staff and advisors and entourage that he's going to draw a hard line with the Soviets on the issue of Poland. He's going to show Molotov what's what. And so that evening, Truman receives Molotov at the White House and immediately broaches the subject of Poland, describing it as, quote, the symbol of our international relations, end of quote. Not exactly a hard line. Molotov, the consummate diplomat, immediately pivots the discussion. He pivots to the Yalta provisions for the Soviet Union to be given the southern part of Sakhalin Island and the Kuril Islands for their entry into the war against Japan. And Molotov immediately shakes up Truman, making it seem that the Russians haven't quite yet committed to entering the war against the Japanese until they have assurances from Truman that he was committed to the terms of the Yalta Agreement in the same way that Roosevelt had been. And so Truman suddenly finds himself taken aback. And rather than pressing Molotov on Poland, he suddenly begins to backpedal about the possibility that the Russians might not be in attacking Japan once Germany is defeated. And so Truman immediately assures Molotov that he is behind the Yalta Agreement and doesn't bring up Poland at that meeting again. That night, after the meeting with Truman, and the next day, as the foreign ministers of Britain, US, and the Soviet Union gather, Molotov shows no indication of any change in policy over Poland. There is a little bit of discussion over the possibility of perhaps delaying the San Francisco conference until the Poland issue is resolved. But it's quickly decided by the other powers that a smooth establishment of the United Nations with Soviet Union's participation is much more important. But Truman is is chafing that he didn't quite put the squeeze on Molotov as he had kind of suggested he would to his advisors. And so Truman suddenly and unexpectedly now calls Molotov back to the White House. And there, he now tells Molotov more forcefully that, quote, the United States government could not agree to be a party to the formation of a Polish government which was not representative of all Polish democratic elements. End of quote. Molotov now gets into the issue of Poland, and he tells Truman that the London pose of the old Polish Republic in exile being excluded were hardly democratic, considering that Poland, before its invasion by the Germans, was an authoritarian military dictatorship and was staunchly anti-Soviet, and were themselves in breach of the Yalta Protocols by not recognizing the Curzon Line, which had been adopted at Yalta as the eastern border between Poland and the Soviet Union. Molotov explained that there's no way that the Soviet Union would tolerate the presence of the London pose in the new Polish government without their endorsement of the Yalta provisions and the Curzon Line as the border. Truman, at least according to Molotov and several other witnesses there, seemed to not understand what Molotov was saying and did not pay attention to him, and repeated his demands several times, interrupting Molotov that the only thing the U.S. wanted was the USSR to comply with the Yalta Agreement. In his autobiography published in 1955, after he was no longer president, Truman writes that he took such a hard line with Molotov that Molotov went ashen and said to Truman, "I've never been talked to like that in my life." Truman writes that he replied, "Carry out your agreements and you won't get talked to like that." The only problem is that of all the witnesses that were at that meeting, including the interpreters and advisors and deputies, nobody can remember this exchange, including Molotov himself. And in fact, Truman is writing this in 1955 during the Eisenhower administration, when the Republicans, of course, defeated the Democratic government, first time since the beginning of the 1930s. The Democratic Party will be accused of being soft on communism. And so the purpose of Truman's memoirs in some way is to defend these accusations now being leveled at the Democratic Party that, you know, they're soft on communism while the Republicans will at least contain communism. In fact, what most people remember of that meeting is actually Truman assuring Molotov that the Polish question can be picked up later after the San Francisco Conference, and that the smooth establishment of the United Nations was the priority of the moment. In fact, Molotov again suggested to Truman just before he jumped to that if Poland is so important, why not? Why don't we just postpone the San Francisco conference until we work out all the problems with with Poland? And of course, typically um, Truman, no, it's okay. Forget Poland. Never mind Poland. And indeed, when Molotov returns to the meeting of the foreign ministers from his second meeting with uh, Truman, he did not seem to be at all upset, and essentially nothing changes in his position on Poland or in Russia's position on Poland. In fact, Stalin himself cables Truman on the day he met Molotov for the second time. And it's Stalin who's actually going to draw a hard line position on Poland. Stalin cables Truman, quote, "You evidently do not agree that the Soviet Union is entitled to seek in Poland a government that would be friendly to it, that the Soviet government cannot agree to the existence in Poland of a government hostile to it. I do not know whether a genuinely representative government has been established in Greece, or whether the Belgian government is a genuinely democratic one. The Soviet Union was not consulted when those governments were being formed, nor did it claim the right to interfere in those matters, because it realizes how important Belgium and Greece are to the security of Great Britain. I cannot understand why, in discussing Poland, no attempt is made to consider the interests of the Soviet Union in terms of security as well." End of quote. And I think it says it all. In other words, Stalin felt that he had respected the British spheres of influence in Western Europe and in Greece, as he had agreed in the percentage agreement that he drew up with Churchill, which Roosevelt afterwards endorsed. And he expected the Allies to respect those agreed upon in the Soviet sphere of influence in the East, where Russian security was at stake. The problem, of course, with Poland is that the British had finally gone to war against Germany in 1939 over the invasion of Poland, and had hosted and allied themselves with the Polish government of that time in exile in London. British commitment to a Polish republic continuity was a significant factor for Churchill and the British, not so much for the United States. And so Truman basically, like other leaders, abandons Poland. The San Francisco Charter goes off without a hitch, with the Soviet Union entering the United Nations and signing off on the UN Charter with all the other countries. The three allies, for the rest of the month, continue working together in the defeat Nazi Germany, and preparing to finish off the war against Japan. American and Russian troops will link up on the Elbe River west of the city of Berlin, and it will be left to the Russians to fight for Berlin itself. The U.S. will and the French and the British will stop at the Elbe River, and eventually that's where the demarcation line will be drawn up as well. But as American and Russian troops are linking up from the west and the east, it's a love fest, essentially. That April of 1945, the Allied armies defeat Nazi Germany, with Soviet troops taking Berlin on the 30th of April, while Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. Some 80,000 Soviet soldiers will be killed in taking the city of Berlin. And on May 8th, Germany now formally surrendered. As the US now becomes focused on finishing the war in the Pacific against the Japanese, they see the entry of the Soviet Union into that war as promised at Yalta essential to winding up the war. Without the Russians, Truman estimated that this war may go on for another year. The atomic bomb had not been tested yet, and nobody had any idea whether it would even work, and had no idea of the power and the decisive role it will end up playing in finishing the war. The Soviets were needed. It won't be until July 16 when we get the Trinity test in New Mexico, the first successful detonation of an atomic bomb. Moreover, on all other issues, including Soviet entry into the United Nations, things were going smoothly between the Allies. Was Poland worth the price of souring relations with the USSR? I apologize, my cat is meowing at me. When no resolution in the standoff on Poland between the Soviets and the Allies was going to come forward, we'll see that Truman is going to blink first. On May 28th, with the war over, the U.S. Special Envoy to the USSR, Harry Hopkins, flew to Moscow and met with Stalin. The principal item on the agenda was the confirmation of Soviet participation in the war against Japan. Stalin assured Hopkins that Soviet troops would be ready to strike at the Japanese in Manchuria no later than August 8th or August 9th. Given assurances that the Americans will ensure that the Chinese sanctions and concessions made to the Soviets in China will go forward, the Soviets promised to continue their support of the reunification of China under the nationalist Chiang Kai-shek. Stalin promised that he was not going to be supporting Mao Zedong's communist faction. And indeed, Stalin hadn't, because he needed the Japanese to be tied down fighting Chiang Kai-shek. The Japanese had not entered the war against the Soviet Union, despite the fact that they were Germany's allies, and that's the way Stalin wanted to keep it. Hopkins will break the deadlock over Poland by pledging that, quote, although there was a strong feeling among the American people that the Soviet Union wished to dominate Poland, President Roosevelt and now President Truman had always anticipated that the members of the present Warsaw regime would constitute a majority of the new Polish provisional government. Bang. And with that, it was over. Once again, Poland is sold out. Stalin, in return, agreed that several non-Lublin Poles, including 3 from London, would be allowed to participate in a conference in Moscow with the current Polish provisional government. Hopkins proceeded now to sell this agreement to Truman by cabling him that, quote, it looks as though Stalin is prepared to return to and implement the Yalta decision and permit a representative group of Poles to come to consult, end of quote. In the meantime, inside of Poland, the remaining AK commanders, AK the Armia Krajowa, or the National Army, that answered to the Republic in London, to the Poles in exiles, and led the resistance against the Germans, and now was in a kind of a low intensity conflict with the Russians. They remained underground, and they continued to challenge the transfer of Polish territory along the Curzon line to the Soviet Union. But now they're invited by the Soviets to come forward and make themselves known in order that they may participate now in this new conference to reorganize the provisional government of Poland. And so when they appear, 16 of their most senior officers are immediately arrested and whisked away to Moscow, where they're locked up in prison and charged with collaboration with Nazi Germany, carrying out intelligence gathering and sabotage at the rear of the Red Army, state terrorism, planning a military alliance with Nazi Germany, owning a radio transmitter, printing machines and weapons, propaganda against the Soviet Union, and membership in prohibited underground organizations. It becomes known as the Trial of the 16. When Harry Hopkins will raise the issue with Stalin, Stalin replies, there is no point in linking the case of the Trial of the 16 with the support for the Soviet-backed government of Poland, because the sentences will not be high, end of quote. And both the British and American governments will share this view. The 16 will be sentenced to 5 years each. Considering it's Stalin's court that's doing the sentences, that indeed The 5 years are not very high. Some of them, however, will not be released to return to Poland until 1955, and I think a couple of them die while in captivity, although it we're not clear what the cause of death was. And that was the end of that. On July 5th, 1945, the exhausted British and Americans finally recognized the Soviet sponsored Polish government and now formally withdraw their support from the stubborn London Poles. Churchill felt that by this point, they had done all they could for the Poles. Short of this issue now spiraling U.S. British relations with the USSR into conflict, there was not much more they could do. And so now the Iron Curtain drops around Poland. As Poland goes under a communist dominated regime backed by Polish communist militias and the presence of the Soviet Red Army, if that's not enough inside of Poland. Now, the big three are going to gather one more time in the Berlin suburb of Potsdam between July 17 and August 2nd. The conference is going to last a little longer than the other conferences because Churchill is facing an election, and halfway through the conference, he's going to return to Britain for the election, and he'll lose. Not so much Churchill as Churchill's Conservative Party, who will be defeated in the first post-war British elections, and the new Labour Prime Minister Clement Attlee is going to return to Potsdam and take Churchill's place. At Potsdam, Stalin meets with Truman for the first time. The meeting is friendly enough, but of course, it's unequal to the kind of easy, trusting relationship that had developed previously between Roosevelt and Stalin. Well, Churchill was still at Potsdam. He and Stalin there discussed Eastern Europe. Churchill again repeated his position that the USSR should have access to the Mediterranean and Pacific Ocean, while Stalin assured him that he did not have any plans for the Sovietization of Eastern Europe. Stalin, however, complained of Britain's and US's demands on changes in not only in the Polish government, but now in the Bulgarian and Romanian governments. The same Polish scenario seemed to be raising its head, and Stalin was arguing the same thing. I'm not interfering or questioning what government is being formed in Greece or in France or in Belgium or the Netherlands. Why are you questioning what governments are being formed in my border regions? There were some increasing problems as well with the communist government of Tito in Yugoslavia. The Yugoslavians were threatening to go to war with British troops in northern Italy over claims to the Trieste region, which bordered on Yugoslavia. Churchill reminded Stalin that they had a 50-50 sphere of influence in Yugoslavia, but Stalin protested, joking that really influence in Yugoslavia was 90% British, 10% Yugoslavian, and 0% Soviet. Stalin had and will have in the future difficulty controlling Marshal Tito. And Stalin explained to Churchill that Tito still had a partisan mentality and was doing things that Stalin himself did not approve of. And again, it raises that question, just how much control Stalin really have over the conduct of Eastern European communist parties at that point. In Yugoslavia, his control was certainly limited, as I had described per Stalin's concept of, quote, progressive democracy. And certainly Tito will be a kind of problem for Stalin right to the end. He's one of those local communist leaders who resent being told by Stalin how to administrate their own countries, surprisingly, and as well are not quite buying Stalin's concept of progressive democracy where there will be, elected to power. They've been fighting the Nazis. They've been fighting their own old right-wing governments, and they want that power now. Stalin's list of priorities at Potsdam had to do a lot with the division of Germany's navy and merchant fleet, the schedule of reparations from Germany, and the resumption of diplomatic relations with the former Axis enemy states that were now under Russian occupation, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria in particular, in which Soviet-backed governments were gradually developing. And of course, another priority for the Soviets, one that goes back to the Crimean War of the 1850s, the Soviets wanted the Montreux Convention on the Turkish Straits renegotiated, giving the Russians and the Turks joint control over the straits, rather than the way it was with Turkey having those straits, as they do today. And so at Potsdam, some of the decisions that were finalized there, reparations from Germany were to be extracted by dismantling German industry and shipping it to the Soviet Union, plus consignment of products from German production left behind to the Soviets as well. And the Americans and British were not too keen on this, realizing that it would mean that German industry in their zones of occupation would be dismantled to meet Soviet reparation needs, and as well its production. Remember, 10% of German production in the West, plus 15% more in exchange for raw materials and agricultural goods from the Soviet Eastern Zone, was going to be dedicated to the German reparation payments owed to the Soviet Union for all the damage and death that they had perpetrated there. Most important to Stalin was the commitment of the Allies to disarm and demilitarize Germany and keep Germany disarmed and demilitarized for the next 50 years at least. As I say, Stalin was expecting U.S. troops to help in the occupation of Germany in their zone, and the British. At Potsdam, the western border between Germany and Poland was finalized, the Oder-Neisse line, and there will be a brutal expulsion of Germans from those territories now under Polish administration. And considering what the Germans did in Poland, you can imagine how vindictive now the Poles were as they expelled Germans from German territory that was now being handed over to Poland to compensate for its eastern territories that were now being handed back to the Russians. At Potsdam, another issue was the question of diplomatic recognition now of Germany's former allies, Italy, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Finland. The Western allies were pushing for recognition and admission into the United Nations of Italy, where they had full military control. But the Allies were reluctant to recognize the Eastern European states, where they did not have military control, where the Russians had military control. Stalin could not understand why the other states, mostly in his sphere of influence, were being treated differently from Italy. In the end, however, Stalin still is looking forward to kind of a cooperative alliance with his former allies against the Germans. And so Stalin agrees to make the recognition of Italy a priority, with the promise from the Western allies to expeditiously consider the recognition of Finland, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania. The matter of the division of the German fleet and the Turkish Straits will be shuffled off to another committee for further study, where eventually we will see these wartime promises will wither and die. Finally, at Potsdam, you get the formation of the Council of Foreign Ministers, CFM. It's established for the Big Three and other allies to continue developing their relationships through their foreign ministers. And as well, it's kind of like an executive board administrating the post-war world order. It's the CFM is a managing executive for the Big Three, and as well administrating occupied territory, both in Germany and as well in the Pacific. And its first meeting is scheduled for October 1945. And so overall, Stalin returned from Potsdam feeling quite satisfied with the results. The U.S. is happy too. It got the Soviets to commit to their attack on the Japanese. With this promise from Stalin, Harry Truman comments to his wife, quote, "I've gotten what I came for. I'll say that we'll end this war a year sooner now, and think of the kid who won't be killed. That's the important thing." End of quote. And of course, for that American kid who won't be killed, there'll be a lot of Russian, Chinese, and Japanese kids who will. As the Russians say, particularly these days in Putin's Russia. The Second World War was won with British stubbornness, American dollars, and Russian blood. The Japanese, they remained faithful to their pre-war non-aggression treaty with the Soviet Union to the end. The USSR and Imperial Japan were not at war until August 9th, 1945, when the Russians attacked as they promised they would. In exchange, the Soviets will get the southern part of Sakhalin Island, and they'll get the Kuril Islands, giving them unhindered access to the Pacific from their Siberian ports, as I had described in the previous lecture, as these kind of concessions were already worked out back at Yalta. August 9th, 3 days after the U.S. dropped its first atomic bomb on Japan, the Soviets launched a massive attack on the Japanese armies in Manchuria and China. Same day, the U.S. dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki. August 15, Japan will surrender and the Second World War will be over. I think the formal surrender comes, if I'm not mistaken, in early September, the actual signing. This, of course, now ends this on and off wars that Russia has been fighting with Japan starting from 1905. We can see the Japanese expansion into Manchuria had threatened the Russians. The Soviet deployment into Manchuria is the largest Soviet military operation in its history. In fact, Russian operation in its history. It's much larger in scope and armament and men than Operation Bagration was, the 1944 counterattack against the Germans in Russia that was coordinated with Operation Overlord, the landing of Allied troops at Normandy. And of course, as you look at this map and the Soviet deployments into Manchuria, we can already see troubles to come as Korea is in that territory. Russians have a lot of interest in North Korea, and of course, Korea is just part of Japan. And so Russians will be pouring into North Korea while the Americans will be making landings in the southern portion of Korea. And together, this being former Japanese territory, as the Japanese had seized Korea in 1911, I think, Korea will kind of come under this kind of caretaker, UN mandated, Allied occupation mandated process where the former Japanese territory of Korea will now be given sovereignty. And there is supposed to be an election in Korea deciding which government will lead Korea, sort of in the way they were going to do in Vietnam once Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh forced the French out in the 1950s. And like in Vietnam, in Korea, it's not going to happen. And we're still living with that problem. But I think I'll touch on Korea a little bit later when it actually is going to unfold. This is still a little early, but this is essentially the setup for what's going to happen in that region. So the Second World War is over. So far, so good. Everybody's friendly and everybody's on board and cooperative. The Potsdam Conference, remember, it had begun on July 17. The day before, on July 16, the U.S. secretly detonated the first nuclear bomb, a small 20 kiloton detonation in the Jornada del Muerte desert, the um, Day of Death desert, Day's Death desert in New Mexico, Operation Project Trinity. Truman is ready to get back at Stalin for his humiliation over Poland. And he tells his staff now, at the beginning of the conference, to watch Stalin's face when he breaks the news to him that the U.S. has developed this amazing super weapon, the atomic bomb, that can vaporize entire cities. And so when Truman tells this to Stalin, he's disappointed by Stalin's reaction. Stalin doesn't appear to be particularly surprised or interested. And of course, the problem here, Stalin knew about the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb long before the US president, Harry Truman, was told about it when he took office. Soviet intelligence had long ago penetrated the Manhattan Project and was collecting information on the progress of the bomb. Soviet scientists, along with, just as the Americans had captured German scientists that they were using, so did the Soviets. So Soviet scientists were working on the atomic bomb as well. And of course, once Truman told Stalin, of confirmed for him, that the Trinity Project was successful and that Hiroshima bomb is dropped, Russian scientists will now carry out this crash program for the Soviet version of the atomic bomb. But Russian intelligence had basically penetrated the highest ranks of British and American intelligence, in particularly British. You're looking at Kim Philby, one of the Cambridge Five, who had been recruited by Soviet intelligence in the early 1930s from various left-wing groups on the campus of Cambridge. They were then encouraged to rise up, to abandon their communist affiliations and rise up in the British bureaucracy and the British establishment. And Kim Philby, for example, becomes a senior in MI6 intelligence officer. In fact, by the 1950s, Kim Philby will be in charge of counter-Soviet espionage, counter-espionage against the Soviets, of all things, a Russian agent. They won't get broken until the 1960s. enormously huge betrayal and breaking of British security. In fact, in the end, Kim Philby is the liaison between MI6 and the CIA in Washington, D.C. Stalin appointed his head of the secret police, um, Minister of Interior, Lavrentiy Beria, his murderous secret police chief, in charge of the atom bomb project. And of course, Beria would manage it in his way. And so Beria, of course, will be one of the few people that Stalin trusts. So he trusts Beria not only, this, by the way, is Stalin's mother that you're looking at on the right, and in the back is his chauffeur and bodyguard, and then Beria. Very close. And so Beria now will go in his way and conclude and manage the Russian Manhattan Project, which is codenamed in Russia Project Enormous. It'll actually make it to the cover of Time magazine, Lavrentiy Beria. September 5th. The war had just ended, and of all the places in the world for things to go wrong in the Grand Alliance between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, and I guess now France, Ottawa. Problem with a Soviet spy by the name of Igor Guzenko. We have a number of books written about this. John Savatsky was writing quite some time ago, but he had good contacts inside the RCMP to kind of tell the Guzenko story from the RCMP's point of view. More recently, Amy Knight, How the Cold War Began, the Guzenko Affair, and the Hunt for Soviet Spies. She certainly got into the most recent declassified archives. These are two good books if you want to read about this story. We often associate Russian spies with the KGB, the agency that emerged out of the NKVD, which emerged out of the GRU, which emerged out of the Cheka, but it's the same agency, known as the sword and shield of the revolution. This is the KGB symbol of it. And the KGB is divided into two directorates, or was divided into two directorates, a domestic security intelligence directorate, and that focused on internal security, suppression of dissidents and so forth. And then it had a foreign directorate. But really the mandate of the foreign directorate of the KGB was about preventing threats inside the Soviet Union originating from outside the Soviet Union. This was a problem back in the revolutionary days and the Civil War years when there were a lot of Russian exiles working to topple the Soviet regime in Moscow. So that was the kind of function of the foreign directorate. Once the Civil War was over and the Soviet communist power was consolidated, this directorate began engaging in some espionage abroad. But there were other agencies. And here you can see the KGB headquarters at Lubyanka in downtown Moscow, maybe 10 minutes walk from the Kremlin. One time it was prohibited to take photographs of KGB headquarters. And of course, once the communist regime collapsed in 1991, there was talk about completely dismantling the KGB. And there was even a period where, there was a KGB store. You could get a Polaroid taken of yourself sitting at the former KGB director's desk. They were giving tours of KGB headquarters. They were kind of trying to present themselves now in the post-communist era in Yeltsin's Russia as kind of like the FBI. They were just like you. And of course, that lasted maybe about 3 months before they threw everybody out. I even had a KGB press pass at that time. All that goes out the window. The KGB will be divided into 2 different agencies afterwards in the 90s. The FSB is the Federal Service for Security. It's the internal agency like the FBI, while the Foreign Directorate becomes the SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service. But it's a much more low-key agency than an agency that very rarely attracts people's attention, that many Russians don't even know exists. And that's the GRU. The intelligence agencies that I had described to you, the SVR and SVB, report to the president of Russia. They're within kind of the presidential cabinet. In other words, they report to Putin. During the communist system, they would report to the Central Committee of the Communist Party. The GRU, however, they're untouchable. They report to the Ministry of Defense, to the military. They're part of the military estate, which is very powerful and deeply rooted inside Russia to this day. And the GRU is, as I say, untouchable. And it is the most powerful intelligence agency inside the Soviet or inside Russia today, and was during the Soviet Union era. The main intelligence directorate. It was originally founded by Trotsky when he was the commissar for war during the Civil War in 1918. And since 1918, unlike the civilian intelligence agencies like the KGB that constantly were being renamed and, it's an alphabet soup of names, the GRU has always remained the GRU. And as I say, there was no public tours. In fact, many Russians didn't even know the GRU existed. And even today, some might not know it exists. In fact, GRU is very similar to the Russian acronym for the CIA, which is ЦРУ. GRU, ЦРУ. Sometimes you say GRU, people think you're referring to the CIA. Its headquarters during the communist era, and I'll leap a little bit into the future here because just maybe give you a little relief from the 1940s, and certainly espionage is such a big part of U.S. Russian relations. So I'll touch on some of it now, rather than trying to get into it more deeply later. But the GRU was located in a suburb, not in downtown Moscow at all, in a kind of compound that had its own airport, the Hodinka airfield. In fact, the Hodinka field is where all those people were trampled when the last Tsar of Russia was being coronated. And it would be the GRU's private airfield, although now it's a shopping mall. It no longer exists. The runway still is there. I imagine they're going to build something on it. You can Google map it if you want, but it's not being used. But during the Soviet era, the GRU was based in the aquarium. It has its own, as I say, airport there, its own hotel and restaurant. There was what was known as the colony, where GRU officers lived. All this was torn down under Putin. This is what the old GRU headquarters looked like. Putin now poured in several $billion into the rebuilding of a new GRU complex. And this is where all that election interference was being run out of, this building here. You can see it's huge. It's almost, stadium sized. This is kind of the back entrance to the building, again from Google Maps Street View. You can see an aerial of the living complexes. They have their own, hockey rink there, helicopter pad, and it's behind these kinds of walled security fencing. Lots of money. And it's the GRU who in 2018, GRU agents are going to be indicted for election interference. As that indictment reads, in or around 2016, the Russian Federation operated a military intelligence agency called the Main Intelligence Directorate of the General Staff, GRU. The GRU had multiple units, including units 26-165 and 744-55, engaged in cyber operations that involved staged releases of documents stolen to computer intrusions. These units conducted large-scale cyber operations to interfere with the 2016 U.S. presidential elections. That's the GRU for you. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. About 10 years ago, we had quite a famous arrest of a GRU officer, a female officer, Anna Kushchenko. Those of you who took my espionage course a few summers ago, will know this story. I won't get into detail, but I'll just to give you the sense of how the GRU worked and still works today. Anna Kushchenko it's not correct to describe her as an agent. She's actually an officer in the GRU, a sworn officer, like a soldier, in fact. It's part of military intelligence. She was born kind of in a privileged family in Russia. She attended um, graduate school in international financing, while at the same time serving in the Russian military, where she was eventually recruited by the GRU and assigned to the most elite unit in Russian intelligence, the so-called illegals. These are spies who are trained to penetrate Western societies without diplomatic cover. Most spies work out of an embassy. Intelligence officers. Again, a spy is someone who betrays their own country for a foreign intelligence service. An intelligence officer is the person who recruits that spy to betray their country, usually working out of an embassy, but an illegal doesn't. And Anna Kushchenko was trained as an illegal, and then with her international finance degree sent to London to kind of pose as a tourist and try to land some freelance finance jobs in the London's financial district. And her job, essentially, is to root herself in Great Britain. And little Anna Kushchenko is a real friendly girl. And she just meets English boy after English boy until she can find the right one. And here he is. Very soon, she's got him in love. And before you know it, they're married. And then straight from the marriage bed, Anna Kushchenko now becomes Anna Chapman, British citizen by virtue of marriage. And she's unique in that she's actually using her real name. She doesn't even have to take on a false identity like the other Russian spies who will be working with her. And so as soon as she gets her passport, she'll dump her beau, her husband, Alec Chapman. Headline is Russian spy, Anna Chapman's husband. I thought I knew her. As I like to say, woe to any husband who thinks he knows his wife. And so she dumps him, she divorces him, and now takes her British passport and identity and lands in New York. And there, with GRU money, millions of dollars, she sets up a real estate leasing business and begins negotiating office leases and meeting everybody and anybody of any worth in New York. And it's not so much Anna Kushchenko who's going to attract the attention of the authorities. It's who she's meeting in various Starbucks. FBI is, of course, keeping track of Russian intelligence officers working in New York City out of the Russian consulate, out of as well the United Nations, where there's lots of Russians. So Russians have a double presence by virtue of the United Nations being in New York City. And so she falls under surveillance. And again, without getting into detail, Anna Kushchenko is caught doing things she should not be doing with the Russians. And so she's busted. as are her other teammates. But she kind of attracts everybody's attention. The spy who loved us, from Russia with love. Russian honeypot tried to sex Obama cabinet official. In Russia, because she becomes a huge superstar, Russian spy, hero of Russia. And she'll be on covers of magazines. She'll, endorse all sorts of products like the Anna Chapman high definition spy glasses. And as well, she'll be used for propaganda purposes. Indeed, she's pretty. Her teammates aren't. But 10 Russian, again, I wouldn't describe them as agents. They're actually operatives. They're sworn members, ranking members of the Russian military and the intelligence service. The so-called Illegos program, they had penetrated Russia by various means, pretending, like in that TV show, The Americans, pretending to be immigrants from other places to the United States. It's quite a roster of them. And some of them actually, just like in fact, I think that show was partly inspired by this case in 2010. They actually have children born inside the United States. And they grow up as Americans. These are highly trained operatives with very, very disciplined psychology, in that imagine living a lie for most of your life, perhaps for your entire life, and kind of imposing that lie as well on your children, and then drawing your children into the process. These two, Andrei Bezrukov, I think Colonel Andrei Bezrukov and Colonel Yelena Vivola, came in through Canada. They actually took the identities of infants who died in Canada around the same age that they were, in terms of when they were born, and used those to acquire Canadian passports and identities, pretending to be actually Canadians. Donald Howard Heathfield and Tracy Lee Foley. In fact, they were officers in the GRU. They settled in this house in the annex in Toronto, bought it with GRU money. That's why this house, I suspect, is still abandoned. Here you can see it's on Walmer Street. There's Bloor Street right there, and of course, it's bought with GRU intelligence money. And I think Canadians are hesitating in seizing it, because who knows what the Russians will seize that might belong to Canadians, in Russia, or what interests. And so the house still, I think to this day, remains abandoned, certainly since 2010, when they were arrested in the United States. They had kept that property. It was using as rental property. It was probably being used as a safe house for the GRU in the annex here in Toronto. They have kids here. The two of them set up a diaper business with its headquarters in Mississauga. That's written about, this kind of diaper distribution business, diapers direct warehouse. They raise their kids in Canada, but eventually Donald Heathfield goes to the Kennedy School at Harvard, and gets himself a graduate Harvard degree, and that gets him a naturalization certificate in the United States, and he's on his way becoming an American citizen. The Americans think he's a Canadian and was born in Canada, not realizing that he actually was born somewhere in Russia and was working for Russian intelligence. And by the time he's arrested, he's very high up in this management consulting company, Global Partners Incorporated. In the meanwhile, his wife, Tracy Foley, gets a real estate license. And so they're active in these various covers. Their kids, of course, famously, once they're caught, their kids will famously want to come back to Canada. And at first, Canada, the government refuses to admit them, but they go to the Supreme Court. And very recently, 2018, the sons of the Russian spies, by virtue of having been born on Canadian territory, even though their parents were, here as enemy agents, the Supreme Court ruled that they are actually eligible for Canadian citizenship, and they have Canadian passports now. I'm not sure if they live here or not. So here you can see the illegals. You're looking at, several hundred years invested. Some of these people have been operating for over 30 years, 35 years, and now it's all blown. Anna Christenko was just the youngest and the prettiest of this particular group. And the way they're caught, of course, is they're betrayed by someone inside the GRU. This colonel, Sergei Skripal, will betray them. He's, of course, arrested by the Russians. He's in Russia. He operated some of these illegal agents, and he'll be put in a cage, but in exchange for these agents, he'll be released, and the Russians will come back to Russia, while Skripal, as an American or British agent, will be allowed to go and settle in England with his daughter. And that's where Sergei Skripal, not that long ago, was going to be poisoned with that nerve agent Novichok that becomes a huge issue. Just, it's kind of a military action. As far as the Russians are concerned, Skripal is a traitor, and he's not going to get away with it, although he has. They failed poisoning him, and they selected that kind of very exotic poison as a message. Here's the KGB admiral GRU admiral who was in charge of the Skripal operation, and the guy that recently replaced him. So that's the GRU, in a nutshell for you, kind of a quick digression. Going back to 1945, Igor Guzenko is an officer in the GRU, but he has diplomatic cover. He will be stationed inside the Soviet embassy on Charlotte Street. We, as Canada, really did not have diplomatic relations with embassies of our own prior to the Second World War. We worked through kind of British legations and so forth, but and then, of course, there was problems with Russia, so we hadn't we didn't recognize the Soviet Union, as the United States did not recognize the Soviet Union until 1933. So the first time the Russians actually, after the revolution, and I'm not quite sure, I guess the Russians never had an embassy in Canada before the revolution. They would have kind of dealt with the British for anything to do with Canada. But 1943, June of 1943, Canada finally establishes diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union as one of our wartime allies now. And so Guzenko, along with his pregnant wife, arrive in Ottawa around 1943. They'll have a baby boy here. And Guzenko's job is to encipher and decipher GRU cables between the embassy and GRU headquarters in Moscow. The thing is that the Russians know that Americans are tapping into diplomatic cables in the US, and so these messages are coming from nuclear weapon spies in the US, but rather than being sent out to Moscow from Russian facilities there, the messages are couriered over here to Ottawa, where the assumption is that Canadians are too polite to tap into Russian lines. And so Guzenko becomes privy to all these nuclear secrets that the Russians are actually have agents deep inside the American nuclear bomb project, in parts of which Manhattan Project are carried out as well as in Canada. Chalk River, not far from Ottawa, is one facility, and as well as in Britain. So Guzenko is privy to all this. Guzenko is very happy living in Ottawa. They end up living in this apartment on Somerset, across from a park. They live in the upper apartment on the right of your screen, and compared to Russia in the 1940s, boy, is Ottawa a paradise. As the war ends, of course, now Guzenko's told that they're going to rotate out the diplomats, the diplomatic staff in Ottawa, and it's going to be time for him to go back to Russia. A few months earlier as well, Guzenko made an error. He left some code books out on his desk, and so he was given a kind of negative report. And Guzenko knows if you make a mistake in Stalin's Russia, in Stalin's Russia, when weathermen used to make an error in forecasting, they were shot as saboteurs. So Guzenko is a little bit apprehensive about now going back to Russia. Moreover, his wife is now pregnant with maybe a second child. And Guzenko wants to stay now in Canada, partly out of fear, partly out of his desire to stay in Canada. And so Guzenko reads how a spy in the United States, a Russian intelligence agent, defected through the New York Times. He took all these documents from a consulate or an embassy in Russian embassy in the United States and went to the New York Times, which then put him together with the FBI, and they negotiated out a refugee status for him to defect to the United States. And so Guzenko figures he's going to do the same thing. And so September 5th is his last day at work at the embassy. The next day, he's got to go to the Ottawa airport, and he's going to be flying out back to Moscow. And so Guzenko decides he's going to grab all the secret files that the GRU held in the Canadian embassy that night, stuffed them in his briefcase. A lot of it was cables from atomic spies. And he walked out with this. And that same evening, he goes over to the Ottawa Journal, in hoping that they're like the New York Times, that they're going to help him. Instead, the Ottawa Journal doesn't want to even talk to him. Guzenko didn't speak English very well, so he just kept muttering, "It's war, it's war, it's war, it's Russia." And the night editor kind of looked at him and said, this doesn't sound like a good news story. The Russians are our friends. Go away. And so now Guzenko is in a panic. It's too late for him to bring these documents back. What's he going to do now? The next morning, by now he knows he can't come back to the embassy. That they've discovered that he didn't show up and his safe has been emptied out. He tries to go see the RCMP, but he goes to the wrong department, I guess, at the RCMP. They kind of shuffle him away. They don't want to have anything to do with him. So he ends up showing up at the Justice Ministry to see our Justice Minister, Louis Saint Laurent, Mackenzie King's Justice Minister, future Prime Minister of Canada. And I guess you could do that in those days. You could actually show up at a cabinet minister's office and try to get an appointment, except Louis Saint Laurent won't see him. Louis Saint Laurent has him sitting there for 2 hours. And then around noon, the secretary comes out and tells Guzenko that, get lost. The minister can't see you. He doesn't have time. He goes back to the Ottawa Journal in the hope that a day editor will help him. They don't want to see him, talk to him. They don't want to have anything to do with any kind of bad news story about our friends, the Russians. He goes to another RCMP section, the Bureau of Naturalization. He begs them for asylum. The RCMP turn him away, tell him to go away. Guzenko tries to go to a Crown attorney. The Crown attorney managed to get somebody from the RCMP security services to briefly interview Guzenko and tells him that there's nothing he can do for him. And so Guzenko now in the afternoon returns back to his apartment just in time for a car from the embassy to arrive with Russians who now are banging on his door. Igor, where are you? Did you sleep through your flight? What happened? By now, obviously, his absence has, there's an alarm has been raised. Guzenko now just fears for his life, that they're just going to come in through the door, grab him, throw him in the trunk of a car, and put him and his family into boxes and ship him off on an airplane back to Russia, where he'll end up executed and his family in the Gulag. I mean, this is Stalin's Russia. Stalin has killed for a lot less than what Guzenko has already done. And so what Guzenko does is he crosses to the apartment on the left, where there is a low-ranking Air Force, a LAC, a leading aircraftsman, the equivalent to a private in the Air Force, who lives there. he now attempts to help Guzenko, and so he calls the Ottawa police. And the Ottawa police just scratch their heads, and there's nothing we can do here. But we'll keep an eye on the apartment. And so Guzenko now, it's terror. In fact, it's 2 days of terror. Guzenko and his family leave their apartment, go across the hall, and stay now in the apartment of this Air Force private. And as night falls, the Russians come back. And now the Russians go in and they break down Guzenko's door. And as they do this, the Ottawa police, who kind of were now had their eye out for suspicious activity there, come running up and grab the Russians from the embassy breaking into Guzenko's apartment. Coming up behind the Ottawa police is a squad of RCMP security service agents who were sitting in the park across the street from Guzenko's place. There's a plaque there now where they were to the whole Guzenko affair, watching the Guzenko apartment. Of course, what happened that Guzenko didn't know was that Louis Saint Laurent, when Guzenko showed up at his office, went to see the Prime Minister, Mackenzie King. That we have this spy here who has this very important information for us. And so Mackenzie King didn't want to have anything to do with it. He said, ignore him. Let's hope he'll go back to Russia, because I don't want Canada, if something is going to go wrong between the Allies, I don't want it happening in Ottawa. The Russians are our friends. This is going to be an embarrassment to us. And so Mackenzie King was ready to let Guzenko disappear. Some low-ranking RCMP officer, I guess when Guzenko did reach the right guy in the security service, decided that they'll put at least somebody to watch Guzenko and see what he's going to do next. And so that's what they were doing. They were sitting there. And so the cops come in, the RCMP come in behind them. Of course, the Russians in that apartment immediately show their diplomatic passports and push by the cops. There was nothing they could do, and return to the embassy. But now Guzenko is scooped up and given asylum, and they start debriefing him. Guzenko gets what he wanted, and he'll now become, eventually, Guzenko will be trotted out in public throughout the Cold War wearing that hood that becomes his kind of trademark. He'll do interviews, he'll do television shows, he'll write a book about Stalin, ghostwrite. It's ghostwritten, The Fall of a Titan. And he'll write his own biography. He'll be given a budget as well to live on. He'll be given a false identity. The name they choose for Igor Guzenko is George Brown. He'll end up living in Mississauga or Oakville in just west of Toronto, complaining that he's not being paid enough by the Canadian government. He's reported to be quite a whiner. But the things that Guzenko reveals Of course, Mackenzie King, when he reads these accounts, will note in his diary that he has never could imagine a species of espionage like this, because everyone suspected Ukrainian immigrants and Slavs and immigrants of perhaps spying for the enemy. As we, rounded up Japanese and Germans and Italians into detention camps and so forth. We've always looked at Ukrainians, especially many in the labor movement, as being communist agents. But what Guzenko reveals is that all these middle class Anglo-Saxon individuals in power are spying for the Russians, kind of like the Cambridge Five. And of course, the full extent of how Canada is being used to exfiltrate information on the atomic bomb project through the GRU station in Ottawa. Guzenko, as I say, will live on. He'll, be a kind of a painter, using his, again, credentials to bring attention to his paintings. Here's a photograph that will be released of Guzenko after his death in 1980. Guzenko, or 82, somewhere in there, he'll die from a heart attack. And this is what Guzenko looked like. He feared for his life and his family's life right to the end. And when you consider what happened to Sergei Skripal, who only outed 10 Russian operatives on one operation, Guzenko is going to be credited with starting the Cold War, starting the process of the breakdown of relations between the United States and Russia. So if the Russians ever got a hand on Guzenko, you could imagine what his fate might have been. He's buried, as I say, either Oakville or Mississauga. Let me see if I can get you the date, actually. 1982. And his wife, Svetlana, will pass away in 2001. September 5th, 1945, in Ottawa, Canada, Igor, Svetlana, and their young son, Andrei, escaped from the Soviet embassy and tyranny. There is a report, a royal commission, issued January 27th, 1946, based on the Guzenko, what he revealed on his revelations. 39 people will be arrested in Canada. 18 will be convicted for spying, including Fred Rose, a minister of parliament, who Guzenko names as spying for the Russians. Fred Rose, I think, ends up going to Poland after he does a prison sentence that I don't think they've ever figured out exactly what he was spying about or for, to the best of my knowledge. So he gets a relatively short prison sentence. But 39 people arrested, 18 convicted as a result of the revelations that he'll make. He was a candidate in the Communist Party, the progressive, also known as Stalin's man, Fred Rose. Stalin's man in Canada, David Levy, has written the book about this case and about Fred Rose's life. The FBI, of course, as well now debriefs Guzenko. And in fact, it's the United States. This is secret. Nobody knows this is happening. It's only a gossip columnist to whom the FBI will leak this information, who make public the story of Guzenko and the arrest of this Russian military intelligence officer, or the defection of this Russian military intelligence officer in September. It's somewhere in January or February of 1946 that it actually becomes public. The FBI, of course, was here from day one. Unlike the Globe and Mail, it's reporting, February, the FBI now joins the Ottawa spy-on. The FBI were here already. And this begins the paranoia that is going to now take place in the United States, how communists operate. Because, as I say, Guzenko reveals that these privileged members of society who we normally would not associate with Russians spying, like the Cambridge Five, these privileged members are in the high places spying for the Russians. And so the first one to go will be Alger Hiss, who's actually FDR's advisor at Yalta. He'll be accused of working for the Russians, and we get the HUAC, House on Un-American Activities. McCarthy is still not there at that point. He'll come in the 1950s. At this moment, McCarthy is getting ready to defend the Waffen-SS soldiers who had executed American GIs during the Battle of the Bulge at Malmedy. He's going to ensure that their sentences are commuted and that they get released because they're great cold warriors against the Soviet Union. That's going to be McCarthy's beginning. Joe McCarthy is that's going to be the beginning of his career as a kind of a blacklister. But that's to come in the 50s. In the 40s, you have these committees, and Alger Hiss, Whittaker Chambers, of course, comes out and says that he did work for the Russians and he had recruited Hiss. And of course, this is Nixon. Nixon is the one who's doing the prosecution here in these congressional hearings. And this is the beginning of Richard Nixon's career. This is where he begins his path towards first the vice presidency in the Eisenhower administration, starting from 1952, and then eventually his election as president in 68 as a Republican candidate. Hiss they'll never be able to prove that Hiss was actually spying for the Russians, but they will convict him for perjury, for lying, and about his association with this guy, Whittaker Chambers, who was a Russian agent, who was a journalist writing for Time magazine, but he worked for the Russians and then turned against the Russians and fingered Alger Hiss. So none of this is, is going to bode well for Russian-American relations. It's the start, although it's occurring outside kind of the public eye. The other thing is the Americans and the Russians know that they're spying on each other. Americans have a program called Venona, where they're intercepting Russian cables. I mean, that's why the Russians came to Ottawa to transmit some of this information. So this kind of espionage, including what we recently have been seeing, is kind of routine. It very rarely breaks the relationship between governments. There's other things that are going to do that. So despite these rising tensions, or maybe I shouldn't characterize them as rising tensions. I mean, this is kind of routine in the world of espionage. But despite kind of promises at Potsdam to expeditiously recognize former Axis countries in Eastern Europe, the Western allies in August after Potsdam, after the war is over, refused to recognize the governments of Romania and Bulgaria until they're satisfied there were free elections held there. And this is when Stalin is lecturing the Bulgarians on the need to reform their electoral structure to allow the participation of independent opposition, um, because he thinks that the communists are going to win. They're going to win, as he's saying, in progressive democracies. And he wants this kind of free election in Bulgaria. He's confident communists will win, and he wants Bulgaria to normalize its relations with the British and Americans because Bulgaria now is in his axis. So he's in a cooperative state, but he gradually is becoming more confrontationary. Greece is now in the full-scale civil war between British-supported monarchists and right elements on one side and the Greek communists on the other side. They're begging Stalin to help them as they're getting massacred. Stalin stays out of the conflict. And he can't understand why the British and Americans are not keeping their part of the bargain. Now, Stalin refuses to sign off on the peace treaty with Italy. And the entire process of readmitting Italy into the United Nations and into the community of nations becomes bogged down. Tito's Yugoslavian army is threatening, as I say, to go to war with the British over the control of Trieste. And there's heavy Russian armor that, Tito's partisans, they're partisans, but they weren't like fighting underground. They had, field artillery and armor that the Russians had supplied them with, weapons supplied by the West as well. So he was fielding an army, and they are taking positions inside of Trieste and its port on the Adriatic Sea, insisting that that territory in Trieste should be ceded to Yugoslavia. And Stalin now begins to voice support for Tito's demands. And here you can see how that Trieste region is going to be divvied up into these various zones between Italy, the Allied occupation, and the Yugoslavians. And so that further complicates these negotiations over Italy. And so the negotiations over the peace treaties in recognition of Italy, Bulgaria, Finland, Hungary, and Romania would now drag on for a year and a half. They're not going to be finalized and signed by all parties until February of 1947. In the meantime, Soviet rhetoric begins to increasingly portray British and the US as having fallen into the hands of, quote, reactionary forces. Relations decisively are beginning now to cool. And so, as the New York Times is leaking the information about the Guzenko defection back in September and atomic spying and the House of Un-American Activities is beginning to come into formation. In February of 1946, an obscure minor U.S. diplomat stationed in Moscow by the name of George Kennan drafts in one frenzied night what has become known as the Long Telegraph, an 8,000-word cable on his perception of Soviet foreign policy, a secret cable to the State Department. In this cable, Kennan argues that Russia's historical sense of insecurity, combined with Messianic Marxist-Leninism, drove the Russians to compulsively probe weak spots along their periphery with the goal of expanding their power and territory at the expense of their neighbors in a quest for absolute security from Russia's real or imagined enemies. Moscow, he argued, would constantly seek expansion, either through annexation of territory or by establishing friendly puppet regimes along its periphery. Kennan writes that historically, the great powers have kept Russia in check. Germany in Europe, Japan in Asia, and Britain in the Mediterranean. But now, none of these powers was sufficiently capable. Only the US was, Kennan says. Kennan argued that Russians must be contained and that only the US is capable of doing this, not through its military power necessarily, but through the discreet promotion of prosperity, stability, and security in those countries directly in the path of Soviet expansionism, as he had characterized it. Confronted by a ring of economically robust and well-armed, stable countries with strong military forces, Kennan argued could contain future communist Soviet expansion. And this would become known as the containment doctrine. The long telegraph was secret for about a year and a half. But then in July 1947, in this very prestigious U.S. journal from the Council on Foreign Relations, the journal Foreign Affairs, is going to publish a version of Kennan's cable as an article called The Sources of Soviet Conduct under a pseudonym, Mr. X. And this officially will launch the containment policy into the public. Writing in response to this article, American journalist Walter Lippmann used the term Cold War to describe the developing conflict between the US and the USSR. And the term sticks to this day. In March 1946 as well, Winston Churchill, now in retirement, travels to the U.S. as the guest of President Truman in Fulton, Missouri. And there, Churchill will make his famous Iron Curtain speech. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow. The communist parties have been raised to preeminence and power far beyond their numbers and are seeking everywhere to obtain totalitarian control. This coins the term Iron Curtain. And certainly from the statistics I showed you in the previous lection, I'm not quite sure whether communist parties had been raised, as Churchill said, to preeminence and power far beyond their numbers. Those were very significant numbers that I ran by you in terms of Communist Party membership. Churchill's speech, when it's reported in the Soviet Union, rattled Soviet public. And fears of a new war began to circulate for the first time. It's one of the several turning points towards the Cold War. Two incidents are going to crack the facade of the post-war alliance. In Iran, Americans, British, and the Russians occupied Iran during the war because the Shah at that time, the father of the Shah we be familiar with, the one of the Pahlavi, the one that will be ousted in 1979, was very pro-Nazi. And so in Iran, the Allies had occupied Iran. That's why the Tehran Conference takes place there. But everyone commits that they'll withdraw from Iran 6 months after the defeat of Nazi Germany. But the Soviets now want some concessions that the British are getting in the southern regions, the Iranian, particularly in terms of oil. The British are already in Iran. It's kind of the oil in Iran is going to be controlled by the British until the early 1950s, where Americans will engineer a coup in Iran and get American oil companies in there. But another story, another course. But nonetheless, the Soviets begin stalling on when they are going to withdraw from Iran and whether they'll even withdraw from northern Iran, particularly on the border of Azerbaijan, where you have Azeri ethnicities in that northern part of Iran. And so there's this kind of ethnic conflict between Persians and Azeris, and Soviets are kind of suggesting that unless they get those oil concessions, they might not leave. The Iranians grant them the oil concessions. Eventually, the Soviets do leave, and then the Iranians renege on the concessions. Again, Stalin is going to back down. He doesn't want to confront the British and Americans, considering he's expecting them to withdraw from other colonies and territories. And so Stalin feels that if the Soviets remain in Iran, why would not the British remain in Egypt, Syria, Indonesia, and Greece, he argues. So that's an issue. The other thing that is exasperating Stalin is the issue of the Turkish Straits. And at this point, the Russians begin to mobilize on the border with Turkey. And the Soviets begin to suggest that they may have to force the Turks into a joint administration of the Straits. And now the Americans and British step in. As again, Russians are mobilizing and holding these threatening exercises on the border of Turkey, Truman now goes before Congress in March of 1947. And he makes a speech in which he asks for funding for Greece and Turkey. And although he never mentions the Soviet Union, Truman, we know who he's referring to when he says, quote, "I believe it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. I believe we must assist free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way," And this becomes known as the Truman Doctrine. It's much more provocative than the speech that Churchill makes on the Iron Curtain, because unlike Churchill, Truman is in power. He is proposing financial aid to Greece, fighting a British-sponsored fight against the communist insurgency there, and financial aid to Turkey, which the Soviet Union is confronting over the straits. And so, yet, as late as March 1947 now, Soviet response is mild. Soviet papers will characterize Truman's policy as U.S. expansionism disguised as a defense of freedom. Stalin himself, however, makes no comment in the Soviet media. So even this far in time, Stalin so far has remained optimistic that things will be worked out. And in fact, February 1947, the peace treaties with all the minor Axis powers had been finally signed. Italy, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and Finland. All that's left now is for the Allies to conclude the final peace treaty with Germany and Austria. The US, Russian, and British alliance is a little tattered, but it's still basically intact 2 years after the war has ended. And Stalin feels, first of all, that it's in his and in the Soviet Union's interest to maintain the alliance with the British and Americans. He still feels that he could best preserve his spheres of influence by keeping the Grand Alliance together, not splitting it. Moreover, he still feels that he needs the Americans in particular to prevent Germany from rearming and becoming a threat for the third time. So this is where we are. The Cold War really has not quite yet begun. It will begin with what will happen next, and that we'll look at in the next lecture.